Hello and welcome to the Scramble. I'm your host, Sarah Montes de Oca. Thank you for joining us. On this special episode, we will discuss recent foreign affairs and their implications for the United States. We'll discuss the ongoing airstrikes in Yemen led by Saudi Arabia, the current ceasefire in the Ukrainian civil war, and the roles the United States and Russia have and will continue to play in the simmering conflict. Joining us on our panel today is Jeremy Shapiro, special guest, and is a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is part of the Brookings Project on International Order and Strategy, as well as a Center on the United States and Europe in Foreign Policy. He has worked as a member of the U.S. Department of State's Policy Planning staff, advising the Secretary of State on policy in the Levant and North Africa. He also provides strategic guidance as a senior advisor to the U.S. State Department on European U.S. policy issues. Next, we have David Sarabian, a senior in political science, and Hunter Terry, a UNLV alum. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
An alliance of Arab nations led by Saudi Arabia has launched airstrikes in Yemen for 13 days as part of Operation Decisive Storm. This operation aims to beat back the Houthi rebels who have currently taken control of the Yemen capital and parliament. Why have the Saudis conducted these airstrikes, and will their support escalate to using ground troops? What does this mean for the Saudis and the region in the future with Saudi Arabia's seemingly unprecedented use of military force?
Well, so far as using ground troops, this Council on Foreign Relations came out with an analysis stating that special operations by the Saudis had been used. According to Al Jazeera, last I checked, the Saudi government had stated that they were using their special operations as part of the overall mission. Of course, if you're using special operations, you can't exactly use them behind enemy lines. That's not what they're necessarily designed for. As far as what the Council on Foreign Relations analysis stated was that they were doing some maritime raids, so getting on a boat, then going and conducting their strike and then slipping back out, oftentimes like Navy SEALs. I think that there's a possibility that the Saudis will escalate things with ground troops if the airstrikes do not continue to be effective.
Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to get a hold of what's going on for a few very obvious reasons. First of all, nobody has any idea about Yemen. It's a country that, broadly speaking, no one had heard of before the Saudis bombed it. It's very poor, it's very backward. It doesn't have a lot, the United States hasn't had a lot of involvement in it over the years, even though there has been a drone campaign going on there. But probably more importantly, we have no idea what the Saudis are doing. That we don't quite know why they did it. They seem afraid of the Houthi rebels, and they fear that the Houthi rebels are backed by Iran, who is their big sort of geopolitical foe in the region. But we don't really have any idea of what they hope to accomplish. It can be very satisfying when you're afraid of something to bomb it. I know that always makes me feel better, but it doesn't always solve your problem. The Saudis seem to have what I've called in other contexts, sort of following the Seinfeld routine, a sort of yada 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 doctrine for Yemen. We will bomb it, yada yada yada. There will be stability and a better government. But how they intend to accomplish that, we don't really know. They haven't shown a plan, and it's very clear that they're not really talking to the United States very much about it. It was in the papers recently that the United States only found out about this operation a few hours before it happened.
The Saudi ambassador was on CNN today, and he's talking, and the big talking point they have is that this is, it's not government groups who are now possessing the weapons, taking control of missile silos and the government, and that they think that's not a legitimate organization, and so they're fighting to put President Hadi back in power. But from everything I can see, the Houthis are fighting because we and Saudi Arabia kind of put him in power in the first place after the Arab Spring, when we gave the former president just a pass, and the citizens wanted to persecute for war crimes. And ever since then, this movement has been growing, and it's been obviously taking a lot of ground slowly. So it's been happening for about 3-4 years. But now, just in this past 6-8 months, they've really gotten to the capital, and now they're moving into what the new capital was. And it's hard to see that this is going to end easily without troops on the ground. And Saudi Arabia seems very motivated to be involved, and whether it's just fear of Iran or if they think that just having this strategic position for the U.S.'s use, for their use as a backstop, is important enough to go to ground troops. I think it's very likely because, I mean, as we've seen over the past decades, we are loath to use ground troops because you hate seeing your people die for reasons that aren't real well defined. But it's the only way frequently to actually see results in the end is to put, more troops on the ground, to get people actually out there actually fighting targets they can see and interact with.
Jeremy, do you think they'll be getting some ground troops or
Well,
sending them over to?
I agree with the basic analysis that they probably need them to accomplish their goals, and I think that that's been seen very clearly in the last couple of weeks because the airstrikes really haven't done a lot to change the balance of the war. The government is collapsing, and the Houthi rebels are taking over pretty much everywhere. And if you're collapsing, airstrikes are kind of nice, but they don't really hold you up. But I think we're sort of taking a somewhat of an American mindset in this and saying, well, therefore they will need to send in ground troops. It's not clear that the Saudis really have ground troops to send in. Sort of the great thing about being from Saudi Arabia is you have a lot of money and you can hire a lot of people to do things. The bad thing is that you don't actually have to do anything yourself, and so you're not very good at anything.
Well, I guess one other strength is because Saudi Arabia is home to both Mecca and Medina, they've been able to form this 10-country alliance where a lot of other Muslim countries are willing to help them because they see them kind of as the guardians of so much of the Holy Land and the holy sites. And whether or not they agree with all their policies, they definitely seem to have co-signed on to at least we'll support you in these actions, whether it's with some troops, whether it's with assisting in airstrikes, logistics. They definitely have assembled a better team of backing than we have managed in many of our Middle Eastern affairs.
I wouldn't go quite that far. We have 70 countries helping us in the anti-ISIL coalition. Probably a bunch of countries you've never heard of, and the vast majority of them are useless. The political backing is, I guess, nice, but they're not actually all that useful for the operations. I think the Saudis are in the same situation, frankly. It's good to have that political backing. It's not really clear that anyone is actually helping them in any material way. And I think that's going to be even more obvious if it comes to the point where the Saudis are asking for ground troops, and everybody will sort of be like, no, after you, no, after you. Because Yemen really has a sort of reputation of being kind of the Vietnam of the Middle East. You can, you can send your troops in, but you're not necessarily going to get them back out. They can really wear them down. The Saudis have been there before many times in the 60s and 70s. The Egyptians were there. For them, it really was their Vietnam. And it's not an attractive place to send ground troops. And if you're victorious at the end of the day, all you have is Yemen, which is really no prize. Nobody really wants it. They just don't want it to upset them.
This strikes me with Yemen as just a way that Saudi Arabia can, as far as its geopolitical foe with Iran, prevent a front from opening. The Houthi rebels, they're backed by Iran. To what extent is unclear. I'm sure some intelligence official knows better than we all do.
Don't count on it.
Don't count on it? Intelligence, right?
But I think you're right to point out that it's very unclear.
Yeah. It's very unclear. But at the very least, it seems at least a way that in this proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the one front you have in Syria with the Saudis supporting the ISIL types and the Iranians supporting Bashar al-Assad, that by the Iranians supporting the Houthis, that it's opening something directly on Saudi Arabia's border, which, depending on how Saudi Arabia is thinking, they could think that this is an escalation of this proxy war because it's moved right to their border. And not only that, but it's created instability right next to their border. Now it's a lot of desert between their capital and Yemen, but that's still right on the border. The second is that if there is ever a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which wouldn't surprise me years down the road, decades, however long it takes, is that this is a way for the Saudis to get some experience in a dry run of conducting actual military operations instead of actually just spending money. It seems that after the fiscal cliff, with the United States just almost teetering on the edge with the world economy and gambling with it, that the Saudis have this attitude that the Americans can't save us. like they did from Saddam in 1991, and that they're starting to step up their game in defending and projecting geopolitical power in that region?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I would clarify in a few different ways. First, I think that the Saudis definitely seem to see the Yemen conflict in the way that you put it as part of their proxy war with Iran, and they are reacting that way. That doesn't mean that it is. It doesn't mean, as you pointed out, the Houthis have been fighting this battle for several years. They have some contacts with Iran, but it's not clear if the Iranians started this fight in order to annoy the Saudis, or the Houthis started it and went to Iran because they knew it would annoy the Saudis. And the truth is that the Houthis are very difficult for anybody to control. But when you're engaged in one of these proxy conflicts, I mean, we saw it in the United States during the Cold War, where we sort of saw every shade of pink as deep red. Every time anybody said anything vaguely leftist in the third world, we thought, oh my God, it's part of the Soviet conspiracy to take over the world. The Saudis seem to be reacting the same way. And they're bringing about a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because just in the way that we did during the Cold War, they're making everybody choose sides, and they're creating proxy wars around them. In terms of the point about their reaction to the lack of U.S. leadership, I don't know. I mean, the U.S. is still very powerful. I think the U.S. could still provide that protection to the Saudis. The financial crisis didn't help, but it didn't fundamentally weaken the United States. And the United States is still more than capable of doing it. But I do think that you're right, that the Saudis are starting to question whether the United States will do it. And I think that when you look at the policies of this administration, you see that after sort of 30 years of defending Saudi Arabia, which is, after all, an incredibly rich, incredibly corrupt, incredibly conservative, Islamist, Salafist, Wahhabi republic that doesn't share any of our values and does execute by beheading more people than ISIS on an average day. They sort of said, well, why are we doing this? What is the point of this? Mm-hmm. They're going to sell us the oil anyway. They can't drink it. Why are we defending them? They could defend themselves. And there was a big debate in Washington over the years about, okay, well, maybe in theory they could, but will they? Or will they just collapse in front of the Iranians if the U.S. isn't there to help them? And so I would argue that the past few years have been a little bit of an experiment with the United States specifically trying to make the Saudis less comfortable with U.S. protection, just to see what they would do, to see if they would have the reaction that you just described, whereby they would stand up and say, well, now maybe we have to do some things on our own. And here they've shown us that they're at least willing to. They haven't quite shown us that they're able to. But we've had enough failures in that region that I think we can be a little bit patient with that and see how they do in Yemen. I think they have demonstrated, as you pointed out, that they can form a political coalition. I think they have a lot to learn militarily, and they frankly have no idea what to do with Yemen were they to win the war.
That seems to me to be one of the most difficult things, is I think we're quick to assume the Iran, Saudi Arabia, conflict, that makes sense. We can frame it that way. We can frame it Shia, Sunni, and I think we lose track of, like you were talking, the different shades of pink and red and where it is. It seems like if you look at it as different kinds of Protestant, Christian nations, there's many different ways of having these ideas. And how close is a Lutheran to an Episcopalian or someone else? There's they are Shia, the other side is Sunni, but a lot of it is tribal, a lot of it is secular, a lot of it has to do with they don't like the influence that we've had in their countries and the influence that Saudi Arabia has had and their president. And it started before the Arab Spring. That was what Social Arab Spring was about. And, Hadi was the vice president, I believe, the last president. It's not like there was some big change. And, under a certain view, I don't know that the Houthis are necessarily, the bad guys from the start of their principles. A lot of what the stuff that they've at least pushed is trying to get transparency and a new government. And I believe they came to a table for negotiations last year, although they didn't ever obviously stop moving forward. But I agree that the biggest question is simply, is it worth the risk? Is where, if you do decide you need ground troops, what is the overall trophy if you do win? Not just how do you win and what's the goal of victory, but once you get that victory, what do you now hold in your hands? Is it still just an unstable Yemen that's going to blow up again in a few years?
And are they just doing it, do you think, just to test also the help that they would get from the U.S., like Jeremy, like you mentioned?
Well, I'm not even sure if it was a test on help they could get from the U.S.
Right.
They informed us they informed us a few hours before it happened. This was, as far as we are aware, it was designed, coordinated, trained, intelligence-wise was collected, and it was executed entirely by the Saudis and their alliance with minimal, if any, help from the United States. And this really seems to be, if there is a prize from this, is preventing a government from taking place right next to the Saudi border that is influenced by or is somehow controlled by the Iranians, and preventing something from happening right on that border.
Yeah, the problem is that, as he was implying, that's a negative aim. So you could conceivably, with enough bombs, prevent the Houthi from taking over, but that wouldn't really solve your problem, because your actual problem is instability. And as long as there is instability,
Then anything can pop up.
Then anything could pop up. Then the Iranians can always go in there and find some group to take over. And so you have a continuing problem forever. This is the lesson that the United States learned, or should have learned, in Iraq. It's easy to destroy institutions, but that doesn't get you anywhere. You have to actually build them up in order to really create the political outcome that you want. Seems like the Saudis don't quite know that, or even if they know it, they just have no idea how to do it. So they just continue with this negative aim of making sure that the current Iranian client doesn't take over. But I think, I think if that's what they want to do, more power to them. Good luck with it. It doesn't seem like a great plan to me, but I do think that from the perspective of the United States, and I really agree very much with what you said, we don't really understand these conflicts. We don't really understand the relationship between the Iranians and the Houthis. We don't understand the philosophical issues at stake, if there are any. We tend to shove them into these conceptual lenses that we can understand: Sunni, Shia conflict, Iran, Saudi Arabia conflict, and these have something to do with it, but generally they are a lot more complicated and a lot more local than that. These things always stem from the local, and then they get sort of overlaid by whatever geopolitical competition they run into. And I think that we have often been instrumentalized in these fights in the Middle East. We have a lot of power, and if we can be convinced to use it, it can make a big difference. But we often don't understand how it's being used. In Iraq, we were occasionally participating in local struggles that we didn't even know we were involved in. And I think that one of the things that the Obama administration is trying to do by sort of backing away from these things, by letting the Saudis do what they will without getting dramatically involved, is to prevent that kind of instrumentalization, to admit that we have some core interests in the Middle East that can be served a little bit from a distance. We need the oil to flow. We need people not to come out of that region and bomb our buildings. And we need Israel to be safe and protected. But it's not clear why we need to be involved in a Yemeni civil war that we don't understand, or even an Iraqi civil war that we don't understand, in order to protect those interests.
Well, let's take a break. Stay with us, and we'll be right back.
You always made sure I brushed my teeth.
You told me that smart was cool.
You always told me to dream big.
To all of those parents who took the time to make raising their children their most important job, we'd like to say,
thank you.
Thank you.
From the bottom of my heart, thanks, Mom and Dad.
This message is brought to you by the U.S. Air Force.
A thus far successful ceasefire has taken place between Ukraine and the Russian-backed Ukrainian rebels after American-led economic sanctions were implemented against Russia. Some have criticized America's response as being not strong enough and merely delaying the problem of Russia's recent aggression. Currently, Russia has been making threats to various nations, including threatening to use nuclear weapons against Denmark if that country joins NATO's missile shield. Has a Ukrainian crisis, now civil war, finally been settled, or will that civil war heat up again? Is the purpose of Russia's threat simply to improve its bargaining position with other countries over its economic sanctions, or is Russia as aggressive as it says it is?
I think that Russia, I hate to say it's posturing only, because they made it clear by going into Crimea that they're not just posturing, but I think they have tended to overstate what they're willing to do recently to try and improve their bargaining position. The sanctions seem to have worked in a lot of ways. I mean, the ruble has been hit dramatically by sanctions and also by oil prices, which has hurt them a lot. And it's hard to see Putin taking things much further right now because he doesn't have enough support in the surrounding region, I don't think. But there is support growing in different areas, and the Russian people still seem to like it, at least a reasonable amount of them. And he certainly showed no sign of backing away from it.
Yeah, I think to really understand the answers to those questions, I think we need to have a little bit more of a concept of what we think the Russians and what we think Vladimir Putin are trying to do, really. It's never been my view that it's been fundamentally about Ukraine. What they were worried about in Ukraine, the reason that they moved into Ukraine, was that they didn't want to see that country move to the West. They didn't want to see that country, in their view, come under the control of the United States and Europe. They didn't want to see that country become democratic right on their border because they were worried about the impact that that would have on them, on the way that the population would perceive their regime. And that means that they needed to destabilize the place. They needed to demonstrate to us that there was no option to bring Ukraine into the Western-led order, to bring Ukraine into the European Union and to NATO, and they needed to ensure for the long term that wouldn't happen. But they had no goals for Ukraine itself. They didn't really want to take over Ukraine. They didn't even want to take most of the areas that they've taken because I guess they're sort of the Yemen of Eastern Europe. They're not actually that valuable. As a matter of fact, they cost quite a bit of money to control, and the Russians would rather sort of control them from afar. So I think that in order to understand whether they're going to continue, I don't think it's fundamentally a question of sanctions. It's a question of whether they feel like they've accomplished that goal and whether they can stop now. And I think that depends a lot on what we do. If we are trying to make Ukraine a success, if we are trying to bring, without agreement with the Russians, if we are trying to bring Ukraine into the European Union, then they will continue to destabilize it. But if we accept what they've insisted on, then they might be willing to stop where they are.
Yeah, the Russians have stated that the expansion of the European Union, the expansion of NATO towards their borders, they view as a threat to their traditional sphere of influence. And many Russian politicians don't even consider Ukraine to be separate from Russia. To an extent, I think it's good to balance between their ideological idea of what they think they want to have versus what they realistically can have, like you said, what they can afford to have or whether it's worth it, or and the ideological, we want this large sphere of influence. As far as their threats to Denmark, you hear a lot in the news, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all ramping up their budgets. Poland is starting to coordinate training of civilian militias with the military, or at least trying to get them old military equipment. And you have the interviews with some of the biker gangs that were used to come in and how they're saying we're ready to go forward. It strikes me as wondering if this might just be a distraction from a new move to either Belarus or Moldova, because we haven't heard much from either of those. But it's been in the interest, and it's been in the expressed Russian interest, to bring those countries back into the fold, so to speak. And the Russians love outsmarting people. They love propaganda. They love all these little tricks to make them think they're sneaky and smart.
Don't
and
we
things
all,
like,
really? Yeah.
But they especially love that Bolshevik, it's cold, but I'm just going to sit here and think. They love that. And I think some of these threats are real. I think some of them are inflated. But I think that they can pose as a distraction from a larger policy that Putin is still trying to pursue, just like the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. 5-6 years later, they decide to go into Ukraine, they're still going to push their policy.
I guess I disagree a little bit. They have a policy of making sure that these countries are not controlled by the West, but they do not want to invade these countries in order to enforce that policy. That is, to put it mildly for them, a second best solution. They will
Finlandization, so to speak.
They would much prefer some level of Finlandization, or maybe a better description of it is a sort of corrupt influence within the country, so that they can control it without having to resort to the types of tactics that they resorted to in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014. Those were failures for them. I mean, they preferred it rather than letting the country go, but they were failures of the mechanisms that they want to use to control these countries. I guess I half agree. If those mechanisms failed in Belarus and Moldova, they would resort to these types of invasions again. Absolutely, those countries are important enough for them to do it, but they're not failing in those countries, and they don't want to resort to those measures. They will just get there if they have to. So actually, we have to think to ourselves, why did they resort to that in Ukraine? Because we thought we were pushing them out, and we put them into a corner, and this is how they reacted. So if we put them into that corner in Belarus and Moldova, they will react that way again.
Well, we'll see what happens. That's all the time we have for today. Share your opinions and any ideas or topics you would like us to scramble about to thescramble.unlv@gmail.com. You can also catch episodes of The Scramble at UNLV-TV. From all of us here at The Scramble, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.